we both support, obviously, strongly the territorial integrity of Ukraine, and our position is clear that we will never, notwithstanding, no matter how long it takes, notwithstanding what methods are used, Canada will never accept the illegal occupation of Ukrainian territory by Russia.
Now, Russia, I think, is increasingly bellicose over Ukraine. The Americans are actually listening a little, at least, to Kiev, but who knows. But what happens in Ukraine could now affect and involve many other nations. I don't believe this is an isolated issue. And we really do need to understand what is going on. I don't believe we do. Those in the Ukrainian community probably do. They're very involved. But Taras Kuzio is an academic, an expert on the region. And there's a meeting tomorrow. Everything will be solved.
No. We've had a similar type of meeting back in September in Minsk. Tomorrow's Minsk 2, as it were. Right. But all sides signed up to Minsk 1 in September. Russian separatists, Ukraine and the West. Russian separatists didn't implement a single article of that agreement. That plus, of course, there's the general lying coming out of Moscow, as we saw from Prime Minister Harper even to Putin's face in Brisbane saying you're a liar. Yeah. So nobody believes, I mean, the negotiations tomorrow have to get over a big hurdle that nobody believes a word that the Russians or separatists say. And they come from an environment where there's a lack of rule of law, so they'll sign anything. It doesn't mean anything, a signature in that part of the world.
It's a bit ironic. It's taking place in the capital of one of the great dictatorships of the region, a place that makes Russia look rather liberal. I don't know. I suppose it's convenient.
Well, actually, it's actually, if you compare Belarus and Russia, Belarus is more liberal than Russia today.
Really?
Yes, and I tell you why.
It's quite despotic, though.
Well, I'll tell you why. Because I think there's an unwillingness, at least on the public domain, for Western governments to talk about Russia as the real Russia. Internally, they know what the real Russia is, because as we saw in the last few weeks in London with the reopening of the investigation of the murder of Alexander Litvinenko, MI5 and British intelligence documents point to a very brutal regime in Russia already in 2006, and they called it an act of nuclear terrorism on this British soil. American diplomatic cables already in 2010 were talking about Russia as a mafia state. So I don't think they actually want to believe or realize that they're dealing with a regime which actually is worse than Nazi Germany. And I'll say this.
Really?
Yes.
Genocidal?
I'll say this. If you ask a Chechen if it's genocidal, they murdered, under Putin, 100,000 out of 1 million people were murdered in Chechnya. Proportionately, that's as high as what took place in Serb-controlled areas of Bosnia. But of course, Russia's a nuclear power. It can get away with war crimes.
Let's talk about what you just said, because there was a tangible ambition and aspiration of National Socialist Germany, even when they were losing the war. It was the absolute elimination of one particular race, not just physically, but also intellectually and culturally. They would never have existed. The elimination of various other groups, gypsies, certainly male homosexuals, and all sorts of other people.
Right.
As bad as Russia is, I think it's a pragmatic dictatorship. They will get rid of whomever is in their way. I don't believe that this obsession with an ideological genocide, I don't think it's helpful to throw around comparisons. It's very different. It's wrong. It has to be resisted, but I don't think it's worse than Nazi Germany. Well, particularly a country that fought Nazi Germany, I know, and they were brutal in many other ways.
Yes.
But without them, the Nazi armies may well have triumphed.
Right. Where it's worse is that Nazi Germany did not have nuclear weapons. That's what makes everybody very scared of what's happening in that part of the world.
Potentially more dangerous, okay.
And secondly, Adolf Hitler, of course, I mean, my father, still alive, he gets a pension from the Germans since the 1970s. He was a slave laborer in Germany. I know very well what that regime was about. But Adolf Hitler wasn't tied to organized crime.
Well, I'd say he was tied to organised crime. It was called the state.
Well, yes, of course,
But that doesn't really help in any way. The reality is that Russia has already broken the law. It's invaded a sovereign state.
Broken the law,
and it hasn't given up any territory. And it plays these silly games. It goes to conferences. It makes gestures. But nothing is being done. And it will move forward, I think, whenever it wants to do so.
Well, it's also pursuing the similar kind of racist objectives in the 1930s. Then the Nazis were talking about defending Germanic-speaking peoples around Germany. Today, Russia is talking about defending Russian-speaking peoples or Russians outside of Russia.
An excuse.
Yeah, yes. For Putin, there are no Ukrainian people. remember, this is a completely racist view. Ukrainians are Russians. They should be within the Russian sphere of influence. Putin's demands to the Ukrainians, which makes me very pessimistic about an outcome of tomorrow, because Putin hasn't achieved those objectives. Putin's demands are basically to make Ukraine capitulate to Russia, because he wants Ukraine to become a federal system whereby each region would have a veto over Kiev's foreign and defense policy. There isn't a federal system in the world that exists like that.
What do we do? I mean, how do we stop then a nuclear power, even if it never uses nuclear weapons, that the threat is enough? The same applies to other countries like Pakistan to a certain degree. What do we do when we have a United States with a foreign policy that is so passive and flaccid? And we have other countries that are very nervous, and we have Russia with enormous mineral resources. I mean, I don't want to sound dark and pessimistic here, but I really have no optimism. I don't think anyone's going to stand up to Moscow and say, you will go no further.
Well, there is a tide changing. There is a mood change in Europe, I think, because of the massive fear of the potential war between two large countries on their eastern border. So there is a perceptible change. Of course, what to do about it? Well, I mean, even if they don't want to go down the path of sending defensive military equipment to Ukraine, they haven't done enough on the economic and financial side. I mean, you know, the head of Gazprom is not on the sanctions list.
No, I know.
Russia could be taken out of the SWIFT payment system. So there are plenty of things in that area that can be done. And even on the defensive military equipment side, you know, we need to get the Canadians on board, because Canadian Parliament is out of sync here with the US Congress. So, I mean, there are options available.
So much that can be done.
There are.
Fascinating stuff. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.